If you clicked on this video, you might be looking for recommendations on the weapon types you should be playing in Monster Hunter Wilds. Let me just slap a big ol' PSA right here at the front of the video. Try out every weapon against the training dummy and play whatever feels the most fun for you. The 14 different weapons available in Monster Hunter all play completely different from one another, but they are all capable of beating monsters solo. Some weapons innately have a more complex moveset and require better positioning and game knowledge to use. So in the beginning, these more difficult weapons might take you some time to fully grasp, but that's not to say you shouldn't play them. I'm just trying to set some expectations for new hunters. We will have 3 total rankings, one for easy, medium, and hard. Easy means these will be the most beginner-friendly weapons and are usually weapons you can just focus entirely on a monster and not have to worry about managing extra resources. Medium might require some resource management, but the kit is simple enough to understand. Meanwhile, hard means you might have some challenges understanding how this weapon is meant to function at first, and it'll take some time to practice. Let's start off with the poster child of weapons for the series, Greatsword. This weapon is designed to be the focal point of balance when it comes to designing monster encounters. The slow attacks teach you about picking your attack timings, the tackles will teach you how to deal with things like monster roars, and the weapon also has offset attacks and guarding capabilities, and finally the weapon also teaches you about the importance of sheathing your weapon for extra mobility. This weapon has everything going for it, plus it doesn't have any extra resources to manage compared to other weapons. As a result, I think this weapon is going to be easy to learn, and I would highly recommend picking up the Greatsword if you're just starting out because, like I said, it does teach you about all the mechanics available to other weapons. Next up is the most popular weapon in the franchise, Longsword. This flashy weapon has a ton of really cool attacks that attracts many players to come and try it out. However, it does have some difficulty picking up compared to other weapons. The Longsword is a weapon that wants to actively counter monster attacks to maintain resources. The kit and resources are otherwise pretty straightforward to understand. As a result, due to requiring some monster knowledge plus having some resources to manage, but still having a pretty simple kit, the weapon would be considered a medium difficulty to learn. Next, we have the most versatile weapon, the Sword and Shield. The Sword and Shield is a weapon type similar to Greatsword in that it can do basically everything. The main difference is that the Sword and Shield has more mobility. This is also the only weapon that allows you to use items like potions while your weapon is drawn. This makes it a little less punishing when you get hit by a monster because you can just instantly heal up without having to sheath your weapon. The biggest drawback for Sword and Shield is the range, but that is relatively minor with how mobile you are. The difficulty for Sword and Shield is easy to learn. The dual blades are this game's most ninja-like weapon. You will dance around monster attacks, unleashing a flurry of attacks. This weapon does have a resource to manage, but it's so simple that I don't really even notice it. The dual blades do not have the capability to block or offset monsters, but your circle or B dash attacks allow you to constantly be repositioning to stay on the monster or avoid attacks. As far as a beginner weapon goes, the dual blades are pretty simple to pick up. The only real challenge is learning when you can use your blade dance since it holds you in place. With all this said, dual blades would be easy to learn. Next up, we have the hammer. The hammer is a weapon with a surprising amount of mobility for how big the weapon is. You can't guard with this weapon, but you're very mobile while you charge up your attacks. This mobility lets you stay glued to a monster and get as many bonks on the head as you can. There's no resource to manage, and your main objective will be to land as many hits on the head and stun the monster as often as possible. Because of this general game plan, mobility, and lack of resources, I would say that this weapon is easy to learn. Next up, we have the more musically inclined hammer, the hunting horn. The hunting horn is a very versatile weapon, but it can be very daunting to learn at a glance. The unique thing about the hunting horn is that all of your attacks generate a different musical note. Each hunting horn has a set list of melodies you can play which have different effects and note requirements. When you play the correct sequence of notes, you store the melody for later use. This means each hunting horn you craft will require you to relearn some muscle memory to make sure you're playing the correct songs. In addition, some of these melodies you can play provide buffs to you and your allies. It's important to try to maintain a higher uptime on these buffs. On top of that, this weapon has no defensive abilities. It does have some built-in move speed buffs, but it's not quite on the same level as something like dual blades or hammer. Because there's so much to manage with the hunting horn and the lack of defensive capabilities, I would say this is our first hard to learn weapon. Next up, we have the lance, which is one of the least flashy weapons in the Monster Hunter games, but man, this weapon does not mess around. It's the most defensive weapon in the game, and the general gameplay revolves around you blocking and countering almost anything a monster can throw at you. You are extremely tanky with this weapon, and anytime a monster tries to attack you, you shrug that attack off and return it right back at the monster. Outside of countering monster attacks, your general gameplay loop is performing little pokes at the monster. This weapon doesn't deal the most damage, but it's so safe and simple that I would rate the lance easy to learn. Next up, we have the the gun disguised as a lance. The Gunlance is a more flashy pyromaniac version of the lance. This weapon also has a very strong defense with its powerful shield. However, the Gunlance trades a little bit of defense for some additional offense by including what is called shelling, or these are your gun attacks. These different shells is a resource that you will have to manage, but it's pretty simple. The real difficulty of this weapon comes from it having very long animations, which can leave you susceptible to attacks. This means if you're not very familiar with some monster attacks and behaviors, you can get punished for overcommitment. Because this weapon requires some monster knowledge to not overcommit with your attacks, as well as being really slow in movement speed, I would say the Gunlance has a medium difficulty to learn. The SwAxe is an amazing weapon. I love the animations for this weapon so much, as well as the general theme. The SwAxe transforms between an axe and a sword. You fight in axe mode, which generates energy for your sword to use. You transform into sword mode to build up an additional energy resource to further amplify your sword form. This weapon has a lot to manage when it comes to resources in order to get good damage from it. In addition, this weapon doesn't really have the greatest defense. It got a little better with wilds because we received a counter as well as an offset attack, but with the counter you still take a lot of chip damage, whereas something like the Longsword's counter does 0 damage, so it seems a little unfair. So because of how many resources you have to manage with the SwAxe, as well as having an expanded moveset since you technically have 2 weapons in one, and finally not having the greatest defensive options, this makes the SwAxe hard to learn. Next we have our second transformation weapon, which is the Charge Blade. In base form, this weapon is a sword and shield, but it can transform into a giant battle axe and perform some pretty heavy hitting attacks. This weapon is the most resource management heavy weapon in the game. The main gameplay loop requires you to charge up files in your sword and shield mode. You then consume files in axe mode to do some pretty cool things. It takes a lot of repetition to understand the general flow of the weapon and get the most out of your resources. On top of that, it's another transformation weapon like the SwAxe, which means you have 2 different weapons to manage. Because of the resource management and expanded moveset, I would rate this weapon as hard to learn. And now for our final melee weapon, we have the Insect Glaive. This weapon requires you to use a little bug friend to go and attack specific monster body parts and gather different colored buffs. The most important buff to have at all times is the red buff, because this gives you access to new charge attacks that deal some pretty solid damage. When you have all 3 buffs, you gain a big damage boost and also access to a brand new attack that deals tons of damage. This weapon's main defense is its ability to jump into the air and dodge monster attacks. It's quite a mobile and safe to play weapon with attacks that don't require super high commitment. The main challenge is playing the buff extraction minigame. Some monsters have parts that can be extremely difficult to hit. Because of that, I would consider this weapon a medium difficulty to learn. The next 3 weapons on this list are going to be our ranged weapons. The light bowgun is first, and because of this weapon's ability to attack from medium range while also being pretty light on your feet, I think it makes it a pretty safe weapon. The unique aspect of this weapon comes from your ability to drop a mine which repeatedly explodes when you or a monster attacks it. The main difficulty of the weapon comes from maintaining good uptime on your mine, as well as managing your ammo well. Each ranged weapon has a different set of ammunition they can use, which makes inventory management a little bit more relevant than melee weapons. As a result, I would consider the light bowgun a medium difficulty to learn. The heavy bowgun is very similar to the light bowgun. The main difference between the two is the heavy bowgun has a little bit more range, but its attacks tend to be a little slower and have more punch. This weapon trades evasiveness with the ability to guard, which means you can initiate power clashes in wild, similar to other guarding weapons like the lance or greatsword. The heavy bowgun also has ammo to manage, similar to the light bowgun, and overall they play very similarly. I would consider this weapon a medium difficulty to learn simply due to the inventory management. And then for our final weapon, we have the bow. I think of the bow as a ranged version of dual blades. You tend to play anywhere from close to medium range, and typically you're going to be using a lot of stamina to dash around. This will make you extremely evasive, and perfect dodges with this weapon will even replenish your stamina, which makes you even more slippery. This weapon requires you to apply something called ammo coatings, which apply different effects. You can think of these as something similar to ammo with the bow guns, but a little easier to manage. However, for what the bow loses in inventory management requirements, it makes up for its need to manage your stamina. And for these reasons, I would consider the bow a medium difficulty to learn. So as I said at the start of this video, I would heavily suggest picking the weapon that best fits your playstyle, not what is the hardest or easiest to learn. So before you decide to dedicate yourself to a specific weapon, please try them all out at least a little bit against a training dummy. You just might find a weapon that surprises you. Let me know what weapons you're thinking about trying out first down in the comments below. But that's all for me. This was GooberTroy saying thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.